The Cheyenne Express was late that day, but when it arrived, it carried no passengers, only blood still dripping through the floorboards. The heat was a physical weight, a thick, invisible wool that pressed against the lungs until every breath felt like swallowing grit. Bitter Creek sat in a basin of dust and jagged shale, a town that seemed to have been dropped by a god who had grown bored of his creation. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of the wooden platform, his boots coated in a fine white powder that looked like bone dust. He pulled his pocket watch from a vest stained with grease and salt, the silver casing hot enough to sting his palm. It was 4:15. The Cheyenne Express was never on time, yet the rails were already singing, a low, vibrating hum that traveled up through the soles of his feet and into his marrow. Elias had been the station master here for 3 years, a job that required him to be a ghost among the living. He spoke little, drank less, and spent his nights staring at the dark horizon as if waiting for a debt to come due. He was a man built of sharp angles and hidden scars, his eyes the color of flint and just as hard. Beside him, Caleb, a boy of 19 with a face still soft from childhood and eyes too bright for this God-forsaken territory, adjusted the brim of his hat. Caleb was the only person in Bitter Creek who still smiled, a habit Elias found both irritating and deeply tragic. "She's coming in fast, Elias," Caleb said, squinting toward the heat shimmer dancing over the northern tracks. The boy's voice was thin, easily swallowed by the wind that whipped through the canyon. Elias didn't answer. He simply watched the black speck on the horizon grow into a hulking iron beast. Usually, the Cheyenne Express announced itself with a triumphant whistle that shook the glass in the saloon windows a mile away. Today, it was silent. There was only the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels and the heavy laboring chuff of the engine, sounding like a dying animal gasping for its final breath. The train didn't slow as it approached the outer limits of the yard. Elias felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a cold needle in the sweltering heat. He stepped back from the edge of the platform, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron key hanging from his belt. The engine, a massive Baldwin 440, was draped in a coat of soot so thick it looked like it had been forged in the center of a coal mine. It overshot the water tower, the brakes shrieking with a metallic agony that set Elias's teeth on edge. Sparks showered the dry weeds along the track, but the train didn't stop until the passenger cars were aligned perfectly with the platform, as if guided by a phantom hand. Steam hissed from the undercarriage in a great white shroud, smelling of sulfur and scalded grease. The town of Bitter Creek began to spill out of the shadows, merchants, drifters, and the hollow-eyed women from the livery, all drawn by the strange, silent arrival. They stood in a semicircle, 30 feet back, their faces masked by the dust. Nobody spoke. The wind died down, and in that sudden vacuum of sound, a new noise emerged. It was a rhythmic, wet drip, drip, drip coming from the gaps in the floorboards of the first-class carriage. Elias walked toward the nearest door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He noticed a dark stain seeping through the wood of the steps, a deep, viscous crimson that looked black in the shadow of the overhang. He reached out to grab the brass handle, his fingers hovering just an inch from the metal. He almost touched it, almost felt the heat of the interior, but a sharp shout from the back of the crowd made him flinch. It was Mayor Halloway, a man whose belly was as large as his ambition, pushing through the onlookers with a silver-headed cane. "Thorne, what's the meaning of this delay?" Halloway blustered, his face turning a sickly shade of plum in the heat. Elias didn't look at him. He was staring at the window of the carriage. The velvet curtains were drawn, but a dark smear ran down the glass, a frantic hand-shaped streak that ended in a smudge of gore. Elias wiped a hand across his mouth. The metallic smell of blood finally hit him. It was a heavy iron scent, thick enough to coat the tongue, mixing with the charcoal smoke to create a perfume of pure slaughter. "Get back, Mayor," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. He finally gripped the handle. It was slick and warm. He pulled the door open. A wave of heat rolled out, carrying with it a stench so foul that several people in the crowd turned and retched into the dirt. Elias stepped into the vestibule, his boots making a wet, squelching sound as they hit the carpet. He looked down and saw a pool of blood 3 inches deep, swirling with the dust of the road. It wasn't just a spill, it was a flood, a lake of human life force that had settled in the low points of the carriage. He moved into the main cabin, his hand resting on the grip of his hidden derringer. The car was empty. The plush blue velvet seats were unoccupied. No hats left on the racks, no suitcases in the aisles, no half-read newspapers fluttering in the draft. There were only the stains. The walls were sprayed with blood as if 1,000 veins had burst at once. It was on the ceiling, dripping in slow, lazy beads over the headrests. It was soaked into the floor, turning the expensive rugs into heavy, sodden sponges. "Elias," Caleb's voice came from the doorway, trembling and high. The boy stepped inside, his face turning ashen. He looked at the empty seats and then at the floor, his knees buckling. He almost fell into the gore, but Elias caught him by the shoulder, his grip iron hard. For a second, they stood locked together in the red gloom, the silence of the train a suffocating weight. Elias almost whispered a warning, a piece of the truth he had kept buried for 10 years, but he saw the mayor peeking through the window, and the words died in his throat. "Where are the people?" Caleb whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. "There was a full manifest, 50 souls from Cheyenne. Where are they?" Elias didn't answer. He walked further into the car, his eyes scanning for a body, a limb, even a single tooth. There was nothing, just the blood. He reached the dining car and found the same scene. Tables were set for tea, the porcelain white and pristine, sitting in puddles of dark red. A silver teapot was still warm to the touch, its spout dripping a mixture of Earl Grey and plasma. He moved toward the engine, his boots leaving red tracks across the iron couplings between the cars. The coal tender was piled high, but there was no fireman. He reached the cab and found the throttle wide open, the pressure gauge needle hovering in the red. The engine seat was empty, but the controls were coated in a thick, sticky film of blood. The floor of the cab was a reservoir of gore, and yet the engine was running perfectly. Elias reached for the throttle to shut it down, his hand almost closing over the lever, but the metal began to vibrate with a sudden, violent intensity. A low, guttural moan echoed through the iron pipes of the locomotive. It wasn't human. It sounded like the scream of the metal itself, a sound of tectonic plates grinding together. Elias yanked the throttle back, and the engine gave a final shuddering gasp before falling silent. The sudden lack of noise was deafening. The only sound was the wind returning, whistling through the empty cars like a flute played by a dead man. Elias climbed down from the cab, his clothes soaked through with a dampness that wasn't sweat. The townspeople were closing in now, their fear losing ground to a frantic, desperate greed. Bitter Creek was a town of scavengers, and a train full of blood but no owners was a prize they couldn't ignore. "There must be gold," a man shouted from the crowd. "A robbery gone wrong. They took the bodies to hide the crime." The mayor was already directing men to pry open the luggage van at the rear. Elias watched them, a cold hollowness expanding in his chest. He knew this pattern. He had seen it in the war, and he had seen it in the raids that followed. "Don't open that van!" Elias roared, but his voice was drowned by the sound of a crowbar snapping the lock. The heavy sliding door groaned open, and the crowd surged forward. They expected crates of bullion or bags of mail. Instead, a wall of liquid spilled out, a literal wave of blood that crashed onto the platform and soaked the boots of the man standing there. It was thousands of gallons, a volume that couldn't possibly have come from 50 passengers. It flowed down into the dirt, turning the white dust of Bitter Creek into a red mire.
In the center of the luggage van, sitting on a lone wooden crate, was a small silver music box. It was the only thing in the entire train that wasn't covered in red. The mayor, his greed outweighing his revulsion, reached out and grabbed it. He almost turned to show the crowd his prize, but his thumb caught the winding key. The box began to play a tinny, distorted version of Home Sweet Home. The sound was fragile and beautiful, a sharp contrast to the carnage surrounding it. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that music box. He had given it to a woman named Clara in a town called Oakhaven a lifetime ago, before he had betrayed his badge and fled with a satchel of blood money. He had told himself she was safe, that the men he had crossed would never find her. The music box was a message, a calling card from a man named Silas Vane, a man who didn't kill people quickly, but preferred to turn their lives into a slow, weeping wound. "Halloway, put that down," Elias said, his voice trembling for the first time. The mayor ignored him, laughing as he held the box aloft. "It's silver! Genuine silver!" Caleb walked toward Elias, his face a mask of confusion. "You know that thing, Elias? I saw your face. You looked like you'd seen a ghost." Elias almost confessed then. He almost told the boy that the blood on the train wasn't a mystery, but a bill being presented for collection. He almost said the name Vane, but a sharp crack echoed from the roof of the station. A bullet tore through the mayor's throat, silencing his laughter. He fell backward into the pool of blood, the music box clattering onto the platform, still playing its sweet, mocking tune. The crowd erupted into a panicked scream, scattering toward the shadows of the buildings. Another shot rang out, hitting the steam pipe of the engine. A geyser of scalding vapor hissed into the air, creating a white wall between the platform and the town. Elias grabbed Caleb and shoved him behind a heavy baggage cart. "Stay down," Elias hissed. He pulled his derringer, but he knew it was useless against a rifleman on the roof. He looked through the gaps in the wheels of the cart and saw figures emerging from the heat shimmer at the end of the tracks. There were 6 of them, mounted on horses that looked as ragged and hollow as the men who rode them. In the lead was a man in a long black duster, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Silas Vane. He didn't ride like a man. He rode like a nightmare that had finally caught up to the dawn. Vane pulled his horse to a halt 10 yards from the platform. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply sat there, watching the blood drain from the luggage van. The silence returned, punctuated only by the dying notes of the music box and the hiss of the broken pipe. "Elias Thorne." Vane's voice was like gravel being crushed under a boot. "I've brought you your family, Elias. I thought you might want to see them one last time. They're a bit scattered, I'm afraid." Elias felt a cold, sharp pain in his gut, a sensation of his entire world collapsing inward. The blood. It wasn't from cattle, and it wasn't from 50 passengers. It was the collective life of everyone Elias had ever loved, distilled into a crimson warning. Vane had gone back. He had found the hidden farm in the valley. He had found the schoolhouse. He had found the peace Elias had tried to build on a foundation of theft. "You're a monster, Silas!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking with a grief so deep it felt like his heart was physically tearing. Vane laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "I'm a businessman, Elias. You took something of mine 10 years ago. I'm just returning the interest. But I'm not here to kill you, not yet. I want you to live in this town. I want you to look at that train every morning and remember the price of your silence." Caleb looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a sudden sharp realization. You knew them? The people who died?" Elias couldn't look at the boy. He felt the weight of his secrets like a mountain of lead. He almost reached out to touch Caleb's arm, to apologize for bringing this darkness to his doorstep, but the boy pulled away, his face twisting in a mask of horror. "You brought this here," Elias whispered. "You're the reason the mayor is dead. You're the reason the train is full of that." "I did what I had to do to survive, Caleb," Elias said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Vane spurred his horse forward, stepping onto the wooden platform. The animal's hooves made a hollow drumming sound. Vane looked down at the blood and then at Elias. "The town is mine now, Elias. Bitter Creek is a graveyard, and I'm the undertaker. You can stay or you can run, but you'll never wash that smell off your skin." Vane turned his horse and rode back toward the riders, his laughter trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. The riders vanished into the dust, leaving the town of Bitter Creek to drown in its own terror. Elias stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at the platform, at the mayor's body, and at the train. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the shale. The red of the sky matched the red of the platform, a world soaked in the consequences of his past. The townspeople began to emerge from the buildings, their eyes shifting from the body to Elias. There was no sympathy in their gaze, only a cold, growing resentment. They saw the man who had brought a curse upon them. A woman stepped forward, her face smudged with soot, and spat in the dirt at Elias's feet. "Get out," she whispered. The sentiment spread through the crowd like a wildfire. "Get out, Thorne! Take your blood and go!" Elias looked at Caleb. The boy was standing by the music box, his hand hovering over the silver lid. He almost picked it up, almost kept it as a memento of the man he thought Elias was. But he stopped. He looked at Elias one last time, his eyes filled with a weary, ancient disappointment, and then he turned and walked away into the darkness of the station house. He didn't look back. Elias was alone on the platform, surrounded by the iron and the gore. He walked to the engine, his movements slow and mechanical. He climbed into the cab and began to work the shovel, flinging coal into the dying firebox. He didn't care about the heat or the smell. He worked until the boiler began to groan, until the steam pressure screamed in the pipes. He didn't want to run. He wanted to destroy. He wanted to wipe Bitter Creek and the Cheyenne Express off the face of the earth. He jammed the throttle forward and locked it with a heavy iron bolt. He leapt from the cab as the engine surged forward, the wheels spinning and throwing sparks that ignited the dry grass. The train began to move, a flaming iron ghost screaming into the night. It picked up speed, the passenger cars rattling and swaying, the blood inside splashing against the windows. It was a spear of fire, aimed at the heart of the canyon. Elias watched from the platform as the train hit the curve at the end of the yard. It didn't make the turn. The engine jumped the tracks, a massive explosion of steam and iron that lit up the desert for miles. The boiler erupted, a roar of pure destruction that sent shards of metal raining down on the shale. The passenger cars followed, crumpling like paper, their velvet interiors consumed by the flames. The blood of his past was being burned away in a pyre of his own making. The town of Bitter Creek stood silent, the orange glow of the wreck reflecting in the eyes of the people. They watched the fire, their greed and fear replaced by a hollow, aching void. The train was gone, but the memory of it would linger in the air like the scent of ozone after a storm. Elias sat on the edge of the platform, his head in his hands. He felt nothing, no relief, no sorrow, just a profound, crushing exhaustion. Hours later, the fire had died down to a glowing ember. The wind returned, carrying the fine white dust of the basin to cover the wreckage. Elias stood up and began to walk. He didn't take a horse, and he didn't take a bag. He walked toward the south, his shadow long and lonely under the moon. He passed the smoldering ruins of the engine, the twisted metal looking like the bones of a fallen giant. He didn't look back at the town, and he didn't look back at the wreck. He reached the edge of the canyon and stopped. He looked at his hands in the moonlight. They were stained a dark, permanent brown, the blood of his family and his failures etched into the lines of his palms. He realized then that Vane was right. He would never be clean. He would never be free. He was a man who traded his soul for a few years of peace, and the price was everything he ever touched.
The low whistle echoed from the north, a ghost of a sound that made Elias flinch. It wasn't a train, it was just the wind through the rocks, but it sounded like a scream. He began to descend into the canyon, his boots crunching on the shale. He would find a new town, a new name, and a new life, but he knew the rails were always behind him. He knew that somewhere in the darkness another train was being readied, its cars empty of passengers, but full of the debts he had yet to pay. The morning sun rose over Bitter Creek, cold and indifferent. The platform was empty. The blood had dried into a dark crust, and the music box sat abandoned in the dirt, its silver tarnished by the soot. The townspeople went back to their lives, their faces harder, their hearts colder. They didn't speak of the train, and they didn't speak of Elias Thorne. They simply lived in the silence of the dust, waiting for the next 4:15 that would never come. The wreckage in the canyon stayed there for years, a monument to a massacre that nobody could explain. The desert reclaimed the iron, the rust eaten through the boiler, until it was nothing but a red stain on the rocks. The wind blew through the empty carriages, a mournful, hollow sound the travelers would hear from miles away. They called it the ghost of Bitter Creek, a story told to children to keep them away from the tracks at night. Elias Thorne was never seen again. Some said he died in the desert, his bones picked clean by the vultures. Others said he became a wanderer, a man who followed the tracks but never boarded a train. But in the quiet moments of the night, when the wind was just right, the people of Bitter Creek could still hear the faint, tinny sound of a music box playing Home Sweet Home, a reminder that some blood can never be washed away. The silence of the territory was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that pressed against the earth. The heat returned, the dust settled, and the world moved on, indifferent to the tragedies of men. But deep in the shale, the iron remains of the Cheyenne Express still bled rust into the soil, a slow, weeping wound that would never truly heal. The train had arrived, the price had been paid, and there was nothing left but the echo of the whistle and the smell of the iron. Bitter Creek remained a town of shadows, a place where the sun felt colder
and the water tasted of copper. The people moved with a frantic, desperate energy, as if trying to outrun a ghost they couldn't see. Caleb grew old in the station house, his eyes never losing that hollow, vacant stare. He would sit on the platform every afternoon at 4:15, watching the horizon, his hand resting on a heavy iron key that he would never use. He almost expected the rails to sing again. He almost expected the black speck to appear. He almost expected to see Elias Thorne standing beside him, his flint-colored eyes searching the heat shimmer. But the Cheyenne Express never returned. The tracks were eventually pulled up for scrap, the wooden ties left to rot in the sun. The town of Bitter Creek faded into the dust, a footnote in a history of blood and iron. The desert was the only thing that remained. It watched the rise and fall of the towns, the greed and the grief of the people, with a cold geological patience. It didn't judge and it didn't forgive. It simply waited for the next story to be written in the sand, knowing that eventually the wind would blow it all away. And in the heart of the canyon, the last piece of the engine finally crumbled into dust, a final silent gasp in a world that had long since forgotten the sound of the steam. The night was long and the stars were bright, casting a silver light over the empty basin. There were no trains, no passengers, and no blood. There was only the wind and the shale, and the memory of a man who had tried to be a ghost, but found he was only a man. The story was over, the debt was settled, and the silence was finally, mercifully, absolute. But if you listen closely, when the moon is high and the air is still, you can still hear the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a past that refuses to stay buried. It is a sound of pure, unadulterated sorrow, a heartbeat of iron and gore. It is the sound of the West, a land built on the bodies of those who tried to run. And as the first light of dawn touches the peaks, the sound fades, leaving nothing but the smell of sage and the cold, hard reality of the morning. Elias Thorne was gone, Silas Vane was a memory, and the Cheyenne Express was a myth. But the blood was always there, hidden just beneath the surface of the white, beautiful dust. The end was not a bang, but a slow, rhythmic hiss. It was the sound of a dream dying in the heat, of a life being consumed by its own shadows. It was the quiet, heavy realization that some trains lead to nowhere and some passengers never arrive. And as the sun climbed higher into the empty sky, the world of Bitter Creek was finally, truly still. There was no one left to tell the truth and no one left to hear the lies. There was only the desert, and the desert doesn't speak. The music box was eventually buried by the sand, its silver casing lost to the grit and the wind. The melody was gone, the spring was broken, and the memory was erased. It was a small thing, a fragile thing in a world of iron and fire. But for one brief afternoon, it had been the loudest sound in the world, a sweet mocking tune that played while a town drowned in its own history. And then it, too, was silent. The desert remained, the heat remained, the dust remained, and far to the south, a man with flint-colored eyes stopped by a stream and washed his hands. He watched the water turn red for a fleeting second before the current carried it away. He looked at the horizon, his face a mask of stone, and then he kept walking. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he was already there. He was home. He was in the West, and the West was a train that never stopped. The final shadow crossed the platform, a long, thin line that pointed toward the ruins in the canyon. The sun dipped below the rim, and the stars came out, one by one, indifferent to the carnage they looked down upon. The air turned cold, the wind died down, and the silence of the territory was absolute. Bitter Creek was gone, the Cheyenne Express was gone, but the blood remained in the soil, a dark iron secret that the earth would never truly digest. The end of the tracks was a jagged, rusted edge, a place where the world simply stopped. Beyond it lay the emptiness, the void that swallowed the men and the machines of the frontier. And as the night grew deeper, the void seemed to expand, a great black maw that waited for the next arrival. There were no whistles, no smoke, and no fire. There was only the haunting, heavy weight of the dark, and the knowledge that some stories can never be finished, only abandoned. Elias Thorne's boots made no sound as he walked into the darkness. He was a ghost now, a man without a name or a past. He was the silence between the heartbeats, the dust in the wind, the shadow on the moon. He was the West, and the West was a train full of blood, rolling through a landscape of broken dreams. And as the first hint of light touched the eastern horizon, the ghost finally vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, hard earth and the sound of the wind. The story was over, but the memory lingered, a faint metallic taste on the tongue. It was a story of iron and blood, of greed and grief, of a man who tried to run but found he was only walking in circles. It was a story of the Cheyenne Express, a train that arrived with no passengers, only blood. And in the heart of the desert, where the heat shimmer dances over the shale, you can still see the tracks leading towards a destination that doesn't exist.
The silence was the final narrator, a voice that spoke without words. It told of the fire in the canyon and the blood on the platform. It told of the boy who waited and the man who ran. It told of the music box and the black duster. And then it told of nothing. The air was clear, the sky was blue, and the world was new. But beneath the surface, the red secret still pulsed, a slow subterranean throb that would outlast the towns and the people and the sun itself. The end, the quiet, heavy, haunting end. No closure, no justice, no peace, just the desert and the dust and the memory of the blood. And as the day began once more, the sun warmed the shale, and the heat shimmer started to dance, a beautiful, terrible lie that would never be unmasked. The train was gone, but the tracks remained, a silver line cutting through the heart of the void, waiting for the next arrival, and the next, and the next. Elias Thorne was a man of the shadows, and in the shadows he would stay. He was the ghost in the machine, the blood in the velvet, the fire in the night. He was the truth that nobody wanted to hear, and the lie that everybody believed. He was the Cheyenne Express, and he was finally, mercifully, on time. The wheels turned, the pistons pumped, and the train rolled on into the darkness of a history that would never be written. The silence was absolute. The story was done.